Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mark Miner and Holly Deshields with McGuireWoods Consulting in Austin. On behalf of McGuireWoods LLP and McGuireWoods Consulting, we'd like to welcome everyone to today's panel discussion. Today's presentation will be recorded, and the material on the presentation is available to everyone who registered. So feel free to contact us for the material after the program is finished. As employers and businesses of all sizes face an array of issues navigating the reopening process in Texas, we hope you'll find today's discussion both informative and timely. Today's panel includes our special guest, Texas Comptroller for Public Accounts, the Honorable Glenn Hegar, who will be giving us an overview of the Texas economy and COVID-19's potential impact on the state budget. Melissa Hensley with McGuireWoods LLP will discuss workplace legal issues around reopening. Debbie Dean with BioIQ will talk about the important issues facing workforce re-entry, including employee and customer safety. And Doug Guinn with Thompson Industrial Services will discuss cleaning protocols for employers and businesses. Upon conclusion, the panelists will be happy to answer any questions you might have. I'd now like to turn over to Holly Deshields for a brief overview of where we are today, including the latest updates on Texas hotspots, with one asterisk there being that the governor is having a press conference right now on Texas hospital capacity, so numbers may be changing, and we'll update you on those numbers, but the latest numbers, here's Holly.
Great, thank you, Mark, and again, thank you all for joining us today. We are really excited to have this a great panel and hope that we have a lively discussion, and please feel free to participate in the Q&A at the end of all of this. As many of you know, Texas is currently in phase 3 of reopening. This means that we are at about 75% capacity for restaurants. Amusement parks and carnivals with counties under 1,000 people can open up at 50% capacity. Businesses are around 50% capacity, as well as bars, wineries, and breweries. So we are at a phase 3, but phase 4 has not been mentioned, and we do not know the timeliness of that yet. There could be indications today, depending on hospital capacity in this press conference with Governor Abbott, but we will find out more later this afternoon. As far as hotspots goes, Texas has set record numbers for hospitalizations over the past 7 days. We have over 2,300 in Texas hospitals, but our capacity still remains strong. We have over 14,000 beds available and about 1,600 ICU beds available throughout the state. Houston had an ICU capacity of 90% on Saturday, so that being one of the biggest concerns. If the hospital admissions continue to climb, then they may have to expand additional capacity to Reliant Energy Stadium. Dallas continues to be second behind Houston. They do have 500 ICU beds available, but that does serve a population base of 7.9 million. So following Dallas is Tarrant County in the third highest cases, and their main concern is their proximity to Dallas. And if Dallas spikes, it really affects the entire DFW healthcare system. And then Travis County also hit a new record of new hospital admissions this weekend. So we are monitoring that very closely. They tend to, anytime there's more than 20 new patients admitted in a day, that is of high concern, and on Saturday there were 30. There are some counties in North Texas and West Texas that are smaller rural counties that have the highest percentage of cases per capita in the entire state, but the common thread in all of these counties is that they all have large animal processing centers. We continue to watch hospitalization rates and infection rates. We will also be monitoring, the delay in test results as well as reporting, and those 3 factors are everyone's main concerns at this point to have the latest statistics. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our State Comptroller, Glenn Hegar, and again, Comptroller, we are so happy to have you, and please feel free to give your comments and insight from your perspective on how all of this is impacting the state and its budget.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's good to be with everybody. Obviously, wish we could be in person, but so be it. It's how we are in 2020. As we were moving through February of this year, which I don't know about everybody else on the call, but at least for me seemed like 1,000 years ago, Texas economy was doing quite well. We were in 129 months of economic expansion, 50,000 job gains in the state of Texas. We were, from a revenue standpoint in the Treasury, we're slightly tracking ahead of the revenue estimate that I had revised last October after the legislative session. Yet then again, obviously, everything that happened in March, first of all, with Saudi Arabia and Russia not agreeing to OPEC cuts at the time, Saudi announcing they were going to increase production, and then very rapidly with the COVID pandemic coming to the United States and starting social distancing here in the state of Texas in the middle of March, very rapidly in that month, we knew that Texas was going to enter into some type of recession like the United States, like the global economy. The question was obviously to what length and how deep. Now, unfortunately, we still don't really quite have a true handle of what that length and that depth may be. But at that point, earlier in March, I started having my staff look at prior events, whether it was the Great Financial Crisis, 9/11, prior recessions, just to try to start getting a grasp of how long did sales tax go down during that time. And those of you that I think all of you know, but just as a refresher, if you look at the state budget, a third is federal dollars, 2/3 is state dollars. Of the state dollar portion of the state budget, roughly $126 billion a year is the total state budget right now in Texas. But of the 2/3 portion that's state money, the largest portion is tax collection. And obviously of tax collection, roughly 58% of all tax collections are sales tax. And so you hear me talk a lot about sales tax because that is the main driver of the health of the state budget. So in Texas, after the Great Financial Crisis, just to make a point, there was a 6-month lag before we saw negative numbers in sales tax data. Yet after we hit that first month in February 2010, essentially there was 14 months in a row of about 9.5% decline. Just not that we expect this event to be similar to that, but at least kind of put in perspective. The point being is it takes a while to get back to the levels of pre-pandemic here in the state of Texas. Texas, has two headwinds facing us right now, not just the pandemic and the economic recovery, which obviously has begun, but also that of the oil industry. The oil industry was having some impacts already before we even got to the COVID pandemic. And part of that was we had noticed sales tax numbers had slightly declined in the oil industry for sales tax purposes in the mining industry again, starting a few months before February. And so that was something we were already watching. And obviously now with so much social distancing around the world, production has started decline in places, but obviously not kept pace with the lower demand and supply. Just a couple of points of the sales tax data of the last couple of months. I told leadership that I was going to give a new revenue estimate in July, in part because we wanted to have several months of collections in, so we had some grasp of the depth of the impact. We knew that there is going to be an immediate impact to sales tax. There was not going to be a delay like there was at the Great Financial Crisis because so many businesses were closed, so many people were laid off during this time period. We all know that as of to date in Texas, we have 2.4 million people that are unemployed and 45 million in the United States. And to put that in perspective, in the United States, the record 1 week for filing of unemployment was in 1982, and that was 695,000 people. And obviously at the end of March the 21st, it was 3.3 million in Texas, in the United States. And then the next week, 6.8 million. So those were just shattered records back then. And just to make a point, here in Texas, we were seeing 315,000 people unemployed. That ticked up. Obviously, the number per week has gone down. Yet, just to put in perspective, after the Great Financial Crisis, there was a 1 week that the peak was at 50,000, and the peak after Harvey was 60,000 in a week. And so, again, just as we all know, these were record drops. And we also saw those in collections in the Treasury. In the month of April, when I reported those sales tax collections, now, again, that was from collections that businesses made in March from you and I, the taxpayers. They collect them, then they remit them to us the following month. So there was a 9.3% decrease in sales tax collections in April of this year compared to April of last year, 2019. Then as of last month, that number went to 13.3% decrease compared to May of last year. A lot of people have asked, Glenn, do you think that that is the bottom? And in all honesty, we felt as though that 13% was going to be a higher number than what it was, a much larger number. I was thinking probably maybe around 20%. Now, where did I get that number? It's just an educated guess because you didn't know what was happening. However, point being is 13% was a little better than what I had anticipated. I think there was obviously some economic activity going on for people that are all staying, those that are staying at home or making home repairs that they put off for a long time. Those that have gotten stimulus checks from the federal government were starting to spend those, which is what the point of them were. People were making IT purchases to be able to work from home. Companies were. So we think that there was some economic activity that we didn't see. Motor vehicle sales tax, it were 45% down in April and then 38% down in the month of May, which was slightly better in May. Then hotels, we started tracking hotel occupancy tax, and at the low it was 22%. It's gone down to 39% compared to, so each month hotel occupancies have increased, yet hotel occupancy tax collections in Texas were down 63% in the month of April, and then they were 86% down last month, which is a record going back to 1982, unfortunately. We also saw, our rig count has continued to go down. Texas was roughly 50% of the oil rigs operating in all of North America. We're now only at 41% at 115 rigs, which is the lowest we can find going back to the records that we have to 1968. So significant impacts. Just a couple other numbers to make a point. We started tracking TSA flights. Never knew that we have on an average of about 2.3 million people in the United States go through airports. At one point, we only had 90,000 people going through airports in that single day, whereas last week it had moved up to 500,000. So significant improvement, but well off of what had normally gone through last week of 2.7 million people. Hourly workers at the beginning were 60% less. Now they're 27% less hours that they are working, so still a significant impact, but obviously showing that some parts of the economy have increased. Open table, as we mentioned, restaurants being able to open to a greater capacity. At the beginning, obviously, there was no reservation, and now they're only down off 50%. And so what does all this mean? In fact, we think that we still need a little bit more months of data to be able to make a determination of how deep this is going to impact the state treasury. But I have told legislators and leadership and said in many speeches that undoubtedly it's going to impact the state budget by the account of billions of dollars. Again, when it's a $126 billion budget, it doesn't take much and it's going to equate to billions of dollars. So I'm on quite frequently calls with legislators as we're trying to track the impact to understand what are we going to have as far as an impact for next legislative session. I've mentioned several times the Economic Stabilization Fund will have at the beginning of session probably about $8.5 billion. We still don't know exactly the federal dollars that will be coming. We know that there are about $16 billion that has come or will come in some shape, form, or fashion that will flow through the state treasury. Some of those for very specific purposes, some of those for COVID-type response, but the Treasury has given some broad discretion as long as you make sure to account for those dollars and how they're being spent when the inspectors show back up later on. So the point being is, I think that legislature will have to make some really tough decisions next session, but one, we don't know the depth and the scope of the downturn. Also, we don't know the amount of federal dollars that we're going to have next session, but I will say, Texas entered this on a much stronger foot than some of the other states. I know we're going to have a very difficult session monetarily, but with that being said, I also look and notice that we're in a lot better shape than some of the other states. One of the things that I've also mentioned to leadership a couple of months ago when I gave them an update for our tax collections in the month of April is to just go ahead and put on notice that when we value property in Texas come January 1 of 2021, obviously there's going to be impacts in the retail space, also impacts probably in the commercial space. Undoubtedly, there's impacts in mineral values because they will not get back to higher levels, we don't think, until the latter part of 2021. Prices may slightly go up per barrel. However, it's going to take a while for that recovery. So, in short, it's been a historic event. It's one that we're still trying to figure out the significant parameters and ramifications of it. However, with that being said, I know people and businesses want to get back to work, And the real last question is, are we going to have some significant type of second wave of the COVID pandemic come this fall or next spring? And we're just going to have to continue to try to keep businesses open as much as possible and protect really those that are most vulnerable and focus on that demographic rather than a much broader brush of shutting down the whole economy. So with that, I'm happy to stop. I know we got some other presenters, and then I know we have time for questions.
Hi, everyone.
Great.
My name is Melissa Hensley. I'm a labor and employment attorney in Dallas with McGuireWoods, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to reopen your businesses and avoid liability in doing so. So as an overview, we're going to discuss the framework and guidance or the standards that businesses will be judged against. Secondly, we'll discuss logistics of bringing individuals back into the workplace. And third, policies and procedures you may want to implement to help guard yourself from such liabilities. So let's discuss what liability claims may look like going forward in the new post-COVID era. So first to consider are tort lawsuits, and this could include garden variety negligence claims, an allegation that you as a business owner failed to act as a reasonably prudent business owner would do under the circumstances. There have also been a number of claims under the theory of public nuisance, and McDonald's has just been sued by such a claim where the allegation is a failure by McDonald's to prevent COVID from spreading within the workplace became a public nuisance to their employees and the families of their employees thereafter. Another thing to consider are OSHA complaints. OSHA has seen a large uptick in claims of unsafe workplaces related to the spread of COVID within businesses and organizations. You've seen a lot of that in the news from the meat packing industries and food processing plants. The most obvious is probably the expected employment-related claims that will be generated from this COVID era. That would include disability, pregnancy, and age discrimination, as well as a variety of wage and hour claims, and we'll talk about those as we go through our slides. But first, let's discuss understanding the framework that business owners will be evaluated upon. So OSHA has set forth some standards, and the first set is to describe or determine what your hazard assessment is for your facility. OSHA has identified 4 classes of occupational exposure due to COVID-19, starting with a low risk, moving all the way up to a very high risk. So if you talk about what that means, it could be a low-risk position may be your employees working from home. From that position, they're not going to be in contact with coworkers or the public, and so the risk is very low, and therefore your obligation as an employer would be very low as well. You move into medium risk, and those would be your employees who have close contact with the public or others who could be infected. That could be your school workers, retail workers, and jobs of that nature, restaurant workers. The high and very high risk categories relate to people who have potential exposure or known exposure to COVID. Obviously, that will include your healthcare workers, medical transportation workers, and morgue workers. So the higher risk category of your business, the more obligation you will have as a business owner to protect your employees and visitors to your job site. So OSHA has provided guidance, and they've published this document called Guidance for Preparing Workplaces for COVID-19. This is something you can find online. Here's what it looks like. There's the picture. And I would recommend that you all consult it and have someone in your facility be responsible for knowing what these guidelines are. It's not a standard or a regulation, and it neither creates new legal obligation nor alters existing obligation. So it really is offered simply for guidance. But it discusses engineering controls that can be implemented to reduce the hazards without relying on employee behavior. So that might mean restructuring your workplace, building socially distant work areas. It talks about administrative controls. These are required actions by your workers to minimize hazards, and it may include things such as practicing safe social distancing and wearing personal protective equipment. When you talk about discrimination, we have to confront and recognize that we have a balancing act to deal with between OSHA and the EEOC. Obviously, under the EEOC, it is against the law to discriminate against someone on the basis of age or disability or pregnancy or the other protected categories. However, OSHA also instructs us that we must consider workers' individual risk factors, including some of those protected categories: age, chronic medical conditions, pregnancies. And under OSHA, we have to implement controls necessary to address those risks for those workers. Obviously, that creates tension. So you can provide for controls to assist those in your workforce who are high risk, i.e. over the age of 65 or pregnant, by allowing them certain accommodations. Maybe they're allowed to work from home longer or work in more isolated settings. But what is clear from the EEOC and the guidance they hand down is you cannot eliminate or refuse to bring back high-risk individuals because of their high-risk status. That is illegal discrimination. So to avoid claims for discrimination, you don't want to single any person out, but you can treat them all differently and have uniform policies that don't violate the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, if you want to do temperature testing, COVID testing, screen people for whether they've had contact with the virus, or ask about symptoms. So as long as you're treating people consistently, this will not violate the ADA. So other claims to think about are wage and hour claims. If you do things such as temperature testing and require it to be done either at home or at work, that is probably going to be considered compensable time. So I would do it at a time if your employees are punching a time clock after they're clocked in. And other types of things that we'll talk about, you've got to consider about what requirements you put on employees and how that affects them from a billable perspective. What is compensable work that they should be paid for? You also have to consider reasonable accommodations under the ADA. Accommodations may include working remotely. You've got to talk about the people who say, I can't wear a face covering even though you've told me I have to because I have asthma. You've got to figure out ways to look at that and determine if an accommodation can be made. And doing that and engaging in that interactive process is going to be required under the American with Disabilities Act. You also need to watch for retaliation and whistleblower claims for your employees who raise COVID concerns, and obviously you should not retaliate against them for doing so. So let's next discuss employer behaviors when they actually return to work. What rules will you put into place? Will you require face coverings? And if so, who will provide them, and who will pay for the laundering time and costs? Believe it or not, this is a wage and hour issue. In some states, it may be considered a uniform, and the laundering of uniforms may be considered compensable work. So before you start implementing a policy on face coverings, I recommend that you look at your local ordinances and laws or contact counsel to get some advice on making sure you're doing it in a manner that doesn't set you up for a class action for a wage and hour claim if you fail to properly accommodate people for requiring them to launder their face masks at home and bring them to work. Other options to think through before you bring your workforce back is how you will socially distance your employees once they're in the workspace. You can do this by altering arrival times and staggering your work days, spreading out your workspaces, keeping some of your employees working from home remotely, or spacing out time clocks or other areas where people will congregate so as to eliminate the situation where employees are stacked on top of each other during the workday. If you have customers at your business location, you will need to think about partitions to limit exposure between employees and the customers. You've seen, I'm sure, at your local grocery stores, the partitions that have been erected between you and the cash register person to keep you all from breathing upon one another. You may limit the number of customers who can enter your store at one time. As we talked about earlier today, Texas is on a 50% capacity in some situations, 75% in others. So you need to look at your local ordinances to determine what capacity is even legal for you at this time as well. And obviously, the restaurant industry has done a great job on curbside service. Lastly, let's talk about, just briefly, let me identify for you some policies that you may want to make sure are in place or implement prior to bringing your workforce back. So first, cleaning and disinfecting policy. You want to make sure that you have someone designated in your workplace to know what the policies are under CDC guidelines and to implement and stay on top of them. Personal protective equipment policies. Make sure you have a contact in your policy that can be contacted by your employees if they have an accommodation request, and also be aware of OSHA and local orders related to face coverings. Social distance policies are recommended within the workplace. Make sure you analyze the entry and egress of your buildings and make sure it can be done safely. A policy related to heightened risk of employees should also be considered, including how to address a refusal to return to work for someone who is in a heightened category. A duty to self-report is advisable. Self-reporting symptoms, self-reporting test results, or self-reporting close contact with someone who has had COVID-19. You also want to consider absence, leave, and accommodation policies. Will those absences be paid or unpaid? Remember, you're going to have a duty to comply with the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, which provides for some paid leave. State and local laws also have different requirements for paid leave. And you'll have to remember to consider disability and religious accommodations when people ask for additional leave. Temperature and COVID-19 testing is allowed by the EEOC. It can be mandatory for your employees. You're going to want to look at a policy and authorizations for getting the test results and having those shared with you, and also consider time and reimbursement of expenses related to having those mandatory tests done. Lastly, you may want to consider your travel and visitor policies to minimize the risk of bringing COVID into your workplace. As you all have seen, this is a rapidly changing environment. The best practice is to stay vigilant and stay informed. McGuireWoods has a COVID task force, so let us know when you need help from us. But in the meantime, here are some other resources from OSHA and the CDC. And you should have someone in your organization designated to monitor and stay informed on the best policies that are being recommended by these organizations. So with that being said, I will now pass the baton to Debbie Dean from BioIQ.
Thank you very much, and it's a great segue into my topic for today, is testing and contact tracing. This is Debbie Dean. I'm with BioIQ. I've been in healthcare for 25 plus years, and I would say we all can say with some level of certainty it is a different world in this pandemic and one we're all having to adjust to. One thing I get asked quite often is about combating the virus and where we are in the stages of the pandemic. And honestly, if you look at vaccine development, treatment, and really herd immunity, we are in the very early stages of this pandemic, so there is a lot more to come. The thing that is very important in the workplace is to develop a back-to-work framework, and that's a basic protocol that goes through such things as symptom and exposure, testing, contact tracing, and notifying and isolation. We recommend that everyone goes through a symptom checker questionnaire every single day because your circumstances can change every single day. For example, in our application, it walks them via IVR on the phone if they don't have access to the internet, or via app or portal, the ability to answer a series of questions about their health. And a series of questions about have they been exposed to someone else that might have these symptoms. If either of those are the case, they are directed to get a test. And in a lot of industries we're seeing, we've been working across multiple industries, everything from manufacturing to the film industry to corporations, And we've seen, for example, in the film industry, one of the recommendations is there's actually testing, and that is available. Once you test, then you have to categorize and deal with that appropriately. If they're a positive, how do you inform anonymously those individuals that they've been around that they should be tested also? So this framework that we put together and the stratification is super important. So we start in our clients with baseline testing for all, and that includes asymptomatic people. As many of you probably know, that people with COVID could be asymptomatic. You don't always have to exhibit symptoms. And so for that, and I'm sure we've all heard numerous examples on the news of one individual that was asymptomatic passing it to a numerous set of other individuals. So that's why you have to do a baseline test for symptomatic and asymptomatic individuals. And then what you need to look at is that stratification and the intensity of your population to develop the cadence of your testing, whether that testing is weekly or it's only when symptoms present. That depends on the stratification of your individuals. And I have an example illustrated on the screen for the airline industry. Pilots and flight attendants are a 3. We have a numbering stratification methodology from 3, 2 to 1 because they have high exposure, but they also have high risk to the business. If, for example, those individuals were to go out for an extended period of time, that puts a risk and a burden on the workplace to continue their business continuity. Then there might be other individuals that are in a home office or even still today working from home that have very low exposure, and they can be in a 1 category. In this scenario, additionally, an example in the film industry for actors, actresses, EPs, directors, makeup artists, all of those individuals are categorized as 3, and they're tested on a weekly cadence. They're tested on a Friday with results back in 24 to 48 hours, and then a return to work on a Monday. One item I want to point out that is super important in all of this is the type of test you do, as well as a lab network. Any one lab, even the large national providers that you might think of, like a LabCorp or a Quest, can get numerous days behind, or even regional labs, depending on their influx of testing that they have to perform. In some of those larger organizations, we've seen delays of 8 to 10 days. So one thing we've employed in our technology platform is a lab network. So we have labs all across the United States, which just gives us the ability to flex and move to a different lab that might have more capacity at that individual day that testing is needed to be done. For example, we have a New York lab, but when New York was in its peak, we didn't actually send any specimens to New York. So if you want to ensure that 24 to 48 hour time frame and get that rapid result, which helps with the business continuity, you need to have an organization to work with or a lab network yourself. Now, currently, we recommend the RT-PCR test, which is an RNA strand, and it is the most reliable test on the market. It's 99.7% accurate. There's very, very rarely, as you can see in the percentage, a false positive, which is what you want, and it's much more sensitive. It's a mid-nostril. It's not all the way deep, so people are more comfortable in the testing process. It's not a throat swab, which we've seen in some testing in certain states actually have a lower positivity rate because those individuals pull back from the specimen being taken by a clinician. And additionally, now we have at home also. There are a variety of settings for the testing model. You can do home sample collection, you can do worksite testing, or you can do retail testing. For example, Walmart is a national partner of ours, and their pharmacists actually facilitate testing on our behalf. So what I have seen in most of the employers that I've worked at in the state is a combination of all these delivers the best continuity for the business to get the most people tested in the shortest amount of time with the most accuracy. One additional piece that I wanted to point out in the overall which test to use, we've been talking about the RT-PCR test, but recently, as of this week, there are tests available that can test for influenza and COVID-like illnesses. So when the fall comes around, it will give you the ability not only to test for COVID, but you can also test for influenza A, influenza B, parainfluenza virus 1, 2, 3, and 4, respiratory syncytial viruses, and other type of respiratory illnesses. This gives the business and the employers in the state the capability to have multitudes of options and things, because at that point you don't know if you have COVID or if you might have the flu or influenza, and that will help actually distill out what the issue is and take the appropriate measures for the workforce. Contact tracing and notification and the different levels that you're allowed to do, person-to-person, anonymous, tracing. We've seen in a lot of our employers, they're actually looking at integrating into the timekeeping and badge system, so that if someone is positive, their badge is deactivated and they're not allowed to enter the workplace. And also the notification allows those individuals that have been around someone with those types of symptoms to be notified anonymously in the appropriate fashion. So remember the few things to take away. You have to target your protocol that works best for your business. You have to choose a lab network. You must ask symptoms questionnaires we recommend daily. You must come up with a cadence for testing, a valid test like an RT-PCR, and in the fall, an RT-PCR with flu combination testing, and you must trace and notify those individuals. And as other speakers have said, there's numerous regulations in this space, and it's very important to make sure that you look to the FDA, you look to EEOC, you look to OSHA to make sure you're following all the appropriate procedures and that you have good partners in this overall endeavor. Thank you for allowing me to speak today, and I would like to turn it over to Doug Guinn from Thompson.
Good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak today as well. I'm going to talk specifically about the factors that you need to consider in keeping your facilities clean and safe, and the disinfecting procedures that you need to consider as you're implementing that. We'll talk about making a disinfecting or cleaning plan, some of the differences and a consideration if you're doing a known or suspected positive case versus preventative or routine disinfecting, what type of equipment is available for disinfecting, and then the procedures and training that you need to take into account as well. The biggest piece of advice that I can give anybody is to utilize the CDC website in terms of all of their recommendations from a disinfection plan and a cleaning. They have it broken down by different industry sectors. They have it broken down by chemicals and by types. This is just a link that takes you to a flow chart that you can use to make your plan. And again, just like with the OSHA site, these are guidelines. They are not hard and fast rules. They are best practices. There is a spot on the CDC website as well that you can go to sign up for automatic email updates. So whenever they make a change to their recommendations, which are quite frequent that you will see, you are on the forefront and you know what those changes are. The biggest thing in terms of your plan is to decide what the level of risk that you have in terms of whether you want to do disinfecting or cleaning. The difference between the two is disinfecting is using an EPA registered list N chemical that is going to be effective and known to kill the coronavirus germs, whereas cleaning is just a more general tool, a good practice that does reduce the risk in the spread, but isn't guaranteed to kill the germs. So use factors like, is this an indoor or an outdoor area? Has it been occupied within the last 7 days? Are there frequent points of contact with people? There's been some back and forth on whether contact surfaces are a high transmitter. Right now, we are still proceeding with our procedures as if they are, and that is the recommendation currently on the CDC website as well. And then the last is it a hard surface, non-porous surface, or is it a fabric or a carpet? And the CDC website does give specific things that you want to consider when doing those type of cleanings. So first, between the difference of known and a suspected case. The most important thing if you're dealing with a known or suspected case is you need to treat the area like everybody that is going to be in it to do the actual disinfecting work has come into contact with the virus. So they need to be 100% protected from a PPE standpoint. That includes wearing a poly-coated chemical suit rather than just a general Tyvek suit that we see a lot of people do. A Tyvek suit does have some porosity to it, so that poly-coated chemical suit in a known or suspected environment is what is recommended. Rather than just a standard KN95 mask, we do recommend wearing a P100 cartridge with a multiple P100 with a multiple organic cartridge respirator, depending on the specific chemical that you're going to be used, and nitrile gloves. You will need to do decontamination of any waste materials that you have with a known or suspected case. All of the PPE and the materials that you use, any kind of rags or anything that came in contact, do need to be treated as hazardous medical waste. So differentiating that from the routine side. The biggest thing, again, is make a plan. Develop specific things as you're going to go through and do routine disinfection on your site. Make sure you have a list and a standard operating procedure of all of the things that you are going to go and make sure that you are getting and disinfecting and coming into contact with when you're doing that. Determine the frequency. We suggest daily if you are in a high contact area or a high crowd area versus weekly for areas that don't get the personal contact that some of the others do. PPE can be more general. When you're doing routine disinfecting, it's really based on the chemical that you're using. Street clothes or a Tyvek suit is recommended. A KN95 mask and nitrile gloves are recommended as well. But again, check with the chemical provider for their specific PPE recommendations. Normally, this is a bleach that can be used with this, and this is really the best way as you're considering to reopen your business to put a positive display to your customers and to your employees that you're committed to doing the right things, you're committed to their safety and well-being, and you're doing everything that you can to protect them. One thing that I will bring up is even with routine and preventive, anybody who is performing this work needs to have gone through a pandemic prevention and infection prevention training so that they understand the proper things from an administrative control standpoint that they need to do to minimize their exposure. In terms of equipment selection, there are a couple different options. Foggers and misters are the most effective in terms of the efficiency that can disinfect the largest area in the shortest amount of time. However, these do require a medium to high upfront capital cost to put these into service. We recommend a quaternary ammonium for this service if this is what you're going to use as the chemical. It's the same type of chemical that is used mostly in food plant disinfecting as well. The foggers that you use could be electrostatically charged, where they actually ionize the fog or mist to make it stick better and coat better on the surfaces that are in the area. Standards work very well also. The pest control type of foggers are what you normally see, but because of the run on this type of equipment, when the coronavirus pandemic started, they can be very difficult to find, and the pricing has gone up as well. So it is more than acceptable to use a standard type of a paint sprayer that you can find at your local hardware or big box store, and you just change the tip on that to a very fine tip that actually produces a mist when you put the chemical in the bucket underneath that sprayer. This is very suitable for electronics as well. You can use this if you are in a control room type of an environment, if you are in a environment such as an office cubicle where there are computers and electronics in the area. Because of the way the mist works, it's not going to create a large liquid coating on those on that type of equipment, so it is more than suitable to use for that. And then the area can be inhabited within an hour or so of that fogging, and that's really not from a safety standpoint. It's more from a creature comfort standpoint. That's when the smell and the vapors have gone and people can return to work. If they are able to stand it, it's really 15 to 20 minutes after that fogging. Everything is dried, the disinfecting is done, and you've had the residence time there. We do recommend an hour for that. The other is with standard liquid sprayers. This is a little bit cheaper, and we recommend this for large areas that have very few type contact surfaces. So an office area cubicle farm wouldn't be a great application for this. It would take a lot of time because of the desk space that you have. So this is one example I use is the hallway of a dorm at a college or university that has the door handles where you don't have to do a full disinfection of a lot of different contact surfaces in that area. You can walk through and just wipe down those door handles fairly quickly with that type of an application. Bleach is recommended at 2% bleach with this, and it's really just the standard backpack sprayers, the lawn sprayers or trigger sprayers that you get normally with a bleach as well. Please be careful. Don't spray liquid directly onto electronics. If this is what you choose to use and there are electronics in the area, spray it into a cloth and wipe it on and then let it sit. Do not allow it to dry because it does have to sit, like I said, for about 10 minutes for the disinfecting action to work completely. So finally, to wrap it up with all of this, with the procedures and training that you're doing, again, I can't stress enough that all personnel performing these services need to have had that specific infection prevention training before they start doing any type of disinfecting service. You need to consider the chemical that makes the most sense for your application, and it's not just as simple as taking the chemical and doing cleaning. This is from a safety standpoint one of the most critical pieces of it, because you have to make sure that you've read the SDS on that chemical, that you're wearing the proper PPE with it, that you're mixing it to the proper concentration for the use as well. Ensure the right PPE is in place based on the chemical manufacturer's recommendations, and is it a preventive versus known positive situation. Make sure you have that detailed checklist as you're going through everything. For food considerations, so quaternary ammonium especially, that I mentioned, is used in food processing plants. While it can't come into direct contact with food itself, it can be sprayed on food preparation utensils and tables. When it dries, it is safe for that food contact at that point. It does not need a second cleaning, and that's why it's very recommended for those types of applications. And then finally, you need to take into account your decontamination and waste disposal considerations. If it is a chemical, if there's specific types of disposal that the chemical requires, make sure that's taken into account. And again, if you have that known positive situation, then you do need to ensure that you are handling it as hazard medical waste. With that, I will hand it back over to Holly and Mark for the question and answer time.
Great. Thank you all so much for this valuable information. Just to give an update from the governor's press conference that was happening at the same time as this call, he did say that we are completely fine as a state on hospital bed occupancy, that there has been a spike in San Marcos and Hays and Comal County of people under the age of 30 testing positive. So TABC will be going in to start cracking down on bars and the River Fund down in that area. He stressed wearing masks and said we would all still continue to have to learn to coexist with COVID for the next few months until we have treatments. And then the other thing he highlighted was where the surges are to make our numbers the highest of record are actually at a federal prison in Beaumont and at 2 assisted living centers, one in Central Texas and I think one in North Texas. So that explains the heightened notice of everybody, but it does seem like it's very contained. And with that, we'd love to turn it over to any questions you guys have. I think our first one is right here, and I believe this will go to you, Doug. If food is wrapped, can you use the quat fog?
You can, as long as you ensure that it is completely sealed, a Ziploc type of a container, or a couple of layers of saran wrap type. You just need to make sure that it's not going to come in direct contact.
Great, thank you. So, Comptroller Hegar, real quick question from Mark and I, but how do you think what is your crystal ball theory on how the legislative session is going to play out in January? Will we be meeting? Will it be virtual? Will it just be to come in and do budget and emergency items? What are your thoughts on that?
I do think, I think that's a really big question. I've had that several times. I do think there's going to continue to be a large amount of social distancing, and so come next session, I think you're going to continue to see a significant reduction in the number of people that are in the Capitol at one time. You're probably going to end up seeing committee hearings that may be more, virtual than in person. I know the legislature, both the House and the Senate are trying to work through some of those issues right now, as in how they will plan to do this. In addition to, we're getting a little bit of a opportunity to see how other states are handling this issue, since many of them have had to be in legislative session this year where we're not. But I do think you're not going to see what we have had traditionally in the past, where it's going to be completely packed Capitol on any given day. Now whether the number of issues is more limited to budget and more critical items, I think that'll be wait to be seen as how leadership wants to handle that, or is that something that they really will want to do from a membership perspective. So I think we'll have to wait and see how that's handled.
Great, thank you very much for that. We have another question, and I think this will either be for Doug and or Debbie, but one participant, they have field trucks where 2 or 3 people share a ride to the work site on a daily basis, and they need to be together. So how can they limit the COVID risk with that ride sharing?
I'll answer it from...
Oh, go ahead.
I'll very quickly, because we have the same consideration. We've come up with a rule where we limit to 1 person per row. As a result, rather than using some of our standard field trucks, we have rented some passenger vans, and then we stagger. So it'll be the driver's side for the front, the person in the second row sits on the right side, 1 person per row staggered. We also disinfect before and after every use with a disinfectant spray that we keep in our trucks and vehicles.
And then from a testing cadence perspective, anyone that's in close proximity to each other, we recommend are on the same testing schedule, if that's weekly, biweekly, and if one of the individuals, say they're on a bi-weekly or monthly cadence for testing, one of the individuals tests positive, then they all go on that same cadence.
And I did neglect to mention, we do require face coverings for any individuals that are riding in the same vehicle, even with the distancing there.
Wonderful, thank you. We have another question here. There seems to be a general consensus on efficacy of wearing masks. What is the view on gloves for consumers or for employers in an office setting? Better to wash hands? Doug?
The evidence and everything that we've seen from the CDC does say that frequent hand washing is more effective than wearing gloves. If you are going to wear gloves, make them the food type, the disposable ones. Make sure they're changed very often as well.
Great, thank you. And Doug, I think this one's for you as well. Given that the vast majority of transmission appears to be airborne, what kind of HVAC and air filtering should be considered?
I do not know the answer to that. It's not something that I've focused on. I apologize. I can do some research and get back to the questioner, Mr. Slavich.
Great, thank you.
I just want to reiterate from what I said at the beginning that the presentation, the slide presentation, will be made available to everybody who's logged in and registered for this event. It has also been recorded, but whoever's registered for this event, everyone on the call will get the presentation and slideshow. Again, on behalf of McGuireWoods Consulting, McGuireWoods LLP, I want to thank our panelists for your participation. That concludes our call today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. But again, thank you for your participation in this call, and the presentation, again, will be sent to you preceding the call. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.